Hello and welcome back to our third episode of our BDSM podcast season. Episode 1 was regarding the butter knife and episode 2 was called We Are All Pay Pigs. This is episode 3 called Allergic to Bad Kink. So if you want to go back and be caught back up to date and everything, go back and listen to those two first and hopefully it will kind of lead in quite nicely into this one. In this episode, we are talking to an anonymous friend, voice acted by our resident narrator at Queer Disrupt, Josh Leach. My friend goes by the pseudonym Matt in this episode, so I can't really say much more than that, but hopefully it will become clear within the episode. We talk about the role of BDSM in kind of private life and public life. We talk about, oddly, the US president at one point. But we also talk about other bits and bobs in terms of engaging with the community and how do we enter communities and have those conversations about entering communities in safe and kind of wonderfully welcoming ways while kind of not really taking the piss where we need to. So there was no kind of piss pun intended there, I promise you. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this one. Just before I go at the beginning here, I just want to remind everyone there is a survey attached to this episode. This is just to find your feedback on how we're finding the seasons overall, what you want to hear from us. I'll kind of casually remind you again at the end, so please do it. It does make a lot of difference. And we'll hope to hear from you soon. Hello, this is my second recording, but I think it's going to be episode 3 when it all comes out, because the way production works, nothing works chronologically, and what is time after all? Time is linear, or is it? Ooh, let's queer time. So, today I'm talking to someone who will remain anonymous for reasons that will become clear, but suffice to say, what I can tell you is I know them. They are being voiced over in this conversation, so the voice you hear is not them. They are involved in various political things and has a kind of semi-public kind of face, as it were. So for those reasons, given the topic of conversation that we are having, they are going to remain about as anonymous as what you know now. They are male, so it's going to be a male voiceover, and that's pretty much it. So first of all, I'm going to give you a name. What name would you like?
Matt.
I'm going to go with Matt. So, Matt, talk to me, Matt. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Great to be with you. Great to be doing this. And yeah, excited to see where this will go and where both of our thoughts will go.
Brilliant. So, first of all, I kind of offered the opportunity to remain anonymous when recording this, and it's something I offer the opportunity to most people, or at least everyone in this particular season, given the kind of topics. So far, in terms of recording, you are the only one who is taking me up on that offer. So I guess I'm curious as to why. So just talk to me. Tell me, why do you want to be voiced over? There's no judgment, but I do want to know what.
Yeah, it's a completely fair question, and what you said in the introduction already pointed to those reasons quite well. I've done things, and I'm looking to do things in the future as well, which just by their nature, politically especially, just create a public persona and come with the need to kind of manage or think about or be conscious of those things that you do and say in public.
So just to jump on there, okay, great. Taking everything you're saying there as you are, why are you choosing remain anonymous then? Why is this bit anonymous versus, say, this public persona that you're creating? That's the kind of connection that I'm trying to draw here.
Right, absolutely. Look, we're going to talk about SM, we're going to talk about kink.
Sorry, SM, could you just clarify what you mean by that? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. That's sadism and masochism. It's about either experiencing pain and enjoying that bit, or being the person inflicting pain on others and getting some kind of sexual or just gratification in general out of that act.
I ask everyone to kind of define what it is, because obviously it can vary depending on who it is. If it's okay with you, for the purposes of this kind of conversation, I'm going to kind of open that up a little bit from just the kind of sadism and masochism, sadism as in sadistic, which is taken as a descriptor now in a very unpleasant way, but it's not used in that way here. But I'm going to open up as well to a level of control as well, which you might call more kind of dom and sub. But I think there's an element of kind of non-physical pain that you can inflict on people. So, for example, financial pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, and there are various psychological games that you can play, I think, within this sphere. And we'll talk about that later on, particularly when we come to, hopefully we're going to talk about something called tunnel games. But we'll come back to that. But sorry, go on, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely. And I think your definition is great there. I have used that as a shorthand, so usually that all kind of falls under the kind of kink, BDSM, whichever word you use, umbrella. I think those things are very often misunderstood, not talked about by people, very stigmatized, and not necessarily people within a kind of queer community. But people who stand outside of that, who maybe have never thought about it, who haven't engaged with it, who might genuinely just not like talking about sex, and think that that is something that shouldn't be in public, let alone, forms of sex which have historically been marginalized, come with, legal trouble and state action against people who have engaged in those things. There seems to be risk, even today, with talking about these things when you want to do something where your kind of image matters and matters to what you do, but not wanting to explain that and constantly kind of justify myself for something is a reason for wanting to be anonymous.
Okay, so I just want to kind of clarify, you talk about making this connection, being stigmatized. You haven't actually told me what is being stigmatized, or stigmatized in what way. Obviously, you kind of view this as a kind of negative connection, but what specifically is the connection? Because, okay, to give you an example, you're going to hate me for making this comparison. Donald Trump, okay? He is a man who was arguably politically in the most powerful position in the world, okay? You can make that claim, you can disagree with it, but it's not an unreasonable claim, I think. No one is denying that maybe Donald Trump is a bad example here. No one is denying that Donald Trump has sex. He has children, he has a family. No one, I think, is kind of openly talking. He's not walking around going, I'm really into, getting an erection and putting it inside my wife and making babies and all that. But no one's expecting you to talk about this kind of what you're saying is stigmatized stuff in that depth either. So no one has a problem with the connection of just sex, as it were, or the act of sexual intercourse. But why then is there a problem to draw, if we're talking about it in the kind of similar vaguish terms, why is there a problem to make that connection with the kind of BDSM conversations that you're having, if that makes sense?
I mean, I would challenge whether we can talk about it in those kind of clean, maybe slightly clinical ways that we tend to talk about sex publicly. Because if I am going to say that I enjoy hitting someone, being hit on my balls, having, various things, me tied up and kind of tortured over an extended period of time, that is necessarily more in depth and more physical than the knowledge of Donald Trump having boring missionary sex.
And that's a terrifying thought.
It absolutely is. It definitely is. And yeah, I'm just not sure whether publicly, we acknowledge sex and it happening. I'm not sure we're having conversations about it. And then the things that fall under the umbrella we're talking about here have also just been connected to being in some way troubled, being criminal, being, insane. And I'm putting that in quotation marks on here because it's a terrible word, right being a risk to others and just not being trustworthy in general. People might find certain things repulsive and disgusting and then put that on you as a person and can't make a distinction between something that is enjoyable in a sexual way and something that you would do in day-to-day life, right? Somebody might go and say, they enjoy this and that in the bedroom, therefore they must also behave like this in a public life setting, and all of those are harmful and all of those have been used against people, and therefore I think it is really important to make that distinction here.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. This is kind of connections that people are drawing, often inaccurately, between certain types of practice. Okay, to give an example, to clarify what I was talking about there, no one has any problem, I would argue, with knowing a politician is in a marriage and has children. For that to have taken place, in most cases, there is a heteronormative couple having sex. But there's no shame with that. I recently saw a headline, just to give you an idea of the date it is at the minute. It's the 22nd of September, 2021. But I recently saw a headline about Princess Beatrice giving birth. And I remember thinking, okay. But you know, like that was even like newsworthy, as it were. But there was no shame. That was a joyful thing. What I'm comparing it to, and I know there were many other complicated scenarios, particularly around kind of homophobia, but I believe it was a Hungarian politician who was caught climbing out the window of like a 30-man gay BDSM orgy or something. And there was an element of ironic kind of schadenfreude or joy there, because he had actually passed a whole series of deeply homophobic laws. Rightly or wrongly, there was a level of schadenfreude there. But I think it's interesting that even if it was openly gay, for example, in arguably a more progressive kind of society, he still wouldn't have been open about that, I think. I don't think he would have spoken about that. So I think that's kind of hinting at that. And I think there's a really interesting kind of demarcation between levels of public and private when it comes to sexual practice that we are able to talk about. I have, and I can't remember chronologically where we are on this now because of recording and when it's going to be aired, but I've been like quite open on some of the things that I've done. I think in a later one I talk about impact play, which is what we would call kind of, I guess, a step up from spanking in that case. So it's kind of closed fist hitting, as it were, in that one. Yeah, okay. I think there's something interesting there to think about in terms of this kind of the scopes of the public and the private, and what is acceptable to kind of mark out within that.
Yeah, your story about the Hungarian politician, which I always wanted to follow up on because I saw that and I found it deeply, deeply hilarious. But I never followed up on it. It's also, if we're thinking about what can be scandalized and what can be twisted in a way that it's worth kind of gawking at, right? Kind of putting it in the front of the tabloids. Birth isn't that. XYZ enjoys a pinwheel across their nipples, probably is, and it will probably be accompanied with a picture of a pinwheel.
So, well, that's a really interesting point. Just to jump in there, why is that scandalous? Why is that worthy of being scandal?
Because I think in the assumed norms of behaviour that we have in society, and I'm saying assumed because I don't think there's good data to say that, this is actually the case. And the assumption is that it's very far outside of the norm and that people don't do that. And that therefore there is something to be discussed, to wonder about, or to find strange, to find bad, to find, promiscuous, maybe as well. It's something I think that comes with that.
That's really interesting. For some of the more kind of academic conversations, and I won't delve into this, it's kind of really reminding me of some of the kind of Foucauldian Victorian hypothesis, which is this kind of, the premise there was there's this kind of stereotype that in the Victorian era, conversations around sex became significantly more repressed. People did not kind of engage with sex in any kind of progressive way. Whereas I think Foucault kind of makes the point there that actually that's not true. Because what happened was the discourse surrounding sex exploded. Because everyone was talking about what sex to not have and what to do and how to do it. And actually, so whilst we have this idea, this hypothesis, as it were, that the Victorian era was incredibly sexually repressed, actually there was this massive, I said the word earlier, explosion of sex coming about. And I think there's something really interesting there in terms of there's this perception of behavior that people don't engage with because we don't talk about it, right? But actually it's a much bigger conversation, a much bigger activity, as it were, that the conversation isn't happening about, if that makes sense. And I think there's something, a really interesting element tying those together, and perhaps a kind of parallel that we can draw over a period of over 150 years? Has it changed?
I mean, what came to my mind is, I feel that moral panic and moral panic discourses.
Sorry, just before you carry on, what do you mean by moral panic? Sorry.
Fear of mostly conservative voices about certain types of behaviours being unacceptable and impacting society in a negative way. If they are talked about, allowed, encouraged.
Oh, sorry, could you just then give me just an example of like moral panic? I have one in mind, but I think maybe you might be able to expound on it. Something about, I've heard the term used around kind of trans people before.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I had in mind. I think there's a really good kind of contemporary example, and the panic there in the sense of, suddenly, supposedly, what we are allowing certain behaviours to happen, people to use bathrooms of their gender identity and not the gender sex that they were assigned at birth, and the supposed danger and that creates, especially in schools. That's a very, very heated discussion where, I think the term panic really applies because it is about an imagined harm, which is kind of put on society by a group of people in the, instance, the kind of queer or trans community, and then the supposed harm that these people are responsible for.
So you're talking like often a marginalized group there that then is being seen as damaging society or causing some sort of kind of moral downfall of society. So I think maybe we can lay this kind of claim against when the pill was introduced. There was this fear that, it was going to lead women to be unbelievably promiscuous, and that's an awful thing because women should be X and this would allow them to be Y.
Yeah, to bring it back to the point that I was going to make, I think, that the kind of very ironic side effect of that is that people suddenly discuss the issue much more and become much more obsessed with it, right? The US, I would argue, is one of the kind of developed countries, for lack of a better term, which is most obsessed with sex and sexualization, despite the idea that sex shouldn't be talked about in public. It happens all the time because of that suppression, I think could be argued.
That's really interesting, actually, I think. And we're straying off from where we kind of imagined this going, but I think this is a really interesting conversation to have, partially because I think you're probably familiar with some of the things I'm about to talk about here. So most of our listeners, I imagine, are pretty familiar with, if not using it, but what Grindr is, right? And Grindr, at least from what I've seen, has never pitched itself as a sex app. Right? They pitch it as a kind of a meeting people app or a kind of dating app. I think I can count on the people on one hand out of everyone I've ever met who actually uses it for dating. It tries to align itself, right, with something more along the lines of Tinder. And yes, of course, people use Tinder to hook up. No one is denying that. But it's never pitched as a hookup act or an app where you can have kind of friends with benefits, where you meet up and you just have sex or engage in that kind of way. Whereas I'm thinking of something like I'm not as familiar. I know Recon is one example which pitches itself specifically as a kink kind of site. And I might be wrong here, but I know there's apps like Scruff, Hornet. I'm expecting all the queers to be making notes as they listen to this. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but I think it's interesting how people align themselves in different ways, where either they just fully embrace, yes, this is about sex and a very particular kind of sex, versus we are absolutely not about sex at all. We can't possibly engage with sex, or sex is such a kind of ancillary to its primary purpose that it's kind of like, oh yes, and people have sex, quietly murmuring in the corner. I think it's interesting how these apps do that and how you're talking about kind of situating yourself. But even within that, I think it's interesting if, for example, a politician was found on something like Grindr. Because, and I think that's happened before in the odd cases, but because no one's actually believing Grindr is just a dating app, aside from the fact the moral panic there was probably because, oh my God, they're gay, or at least not straight in that case, or they're engaging in non-heteronormative kind of activity. There's a kind of tying together there of, again, oh my God, you're untrustworthy. And perhaps we can draw a parallel to this between Pete Buttigieg, I never know how to say his name, Pete Buttigieg, because he was openly gay, right? And a lot of people tried to use that against him, but they weren't trying to use the gay equals bad. They were trying to engage with the fact that gay, therefore he's having gay sex. And that's dirty and ooh and weird and gross, and I don't like that. And then, oh my God, he's having a child, which wasn't done in a heteronormative way. And oh my God, what awful influence is he having on this child? And it's not a real child, they're not a real family.
Yes, although, I mean, that being said, I think Pete Buttigieg, if we focus on his sexuality purposefully, I would argue maybe just because he likes it, living a very, heteronormative life, he's married, he's having a child, he's talking about all the traditional family values, which a lot of people find a lot of pleasure in, but also doing that in a way because, it can shield him, I'm assuming, and I think rightly assuming, from possible attacks that might come with his sexuality.
Well, this links really nicely, actually, to the next point I think that we're going to talk about. We're talking about attacks on kind of elements of sexuality, right? And kind of, or aspects of sexuality that people engage with. And I think you made a very fair point. Pete Buttigieg, I can only apologize for butchering that name, but I imagine I'll put it in the show notes because if you're trying to spell it from the way I said it, it's not going to go well. But I think there's something really interesting there about the fact that he has in some way protected himself from these attacks by living a kind of very, in kind of academic circles, a homonormativity, which is a very simplified definition and perhaps a very clumsy definition here, but for the purposes I hope will suffice. The idea of someone who lives their life as a queer person, or in this case, a homosexual, instead of living that in a way which is perhaps reflective of many people's experience, he's living it in a way to align with very heterosexual understandings of what one's existence in society is. In this case, a very traditional understanding of what a family is. And it's often leveled as a kind of critique against people that just because they are gay or queer doesn't mean actually they are necessarily by default progressive because of that feature. You can actually assimilate yourself into a certain lifestyle. And I'm saying this as a person who has been married, as a person who I've inhabited various parts of that. But interestingly, a bit of a tidbit of a side story, I was only married, as in marriage, because the paperwork for the civil partnership wasn't ready at the time, because the registrar was so used to queer couples coming in and going, they want a marriage rather than a civil partnership. She had them all prepared out, but not the civil partnership one. So we were going to have to wait for ages, and everyone is in a rush, including the registrar. So I remember looking at my then partner and going, or fiance, and looking at him and going, shall we just get it? Yeah, okay, cool, let's just get married, cool. So the whole thing was done in a matter of minutes. Which is actually going to be quite an interesting thing. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on that, actually, because for us, it was a very minor thing. But then again, why did we want to get civil partnered in the first place rather than married? And is there a kind of a betrayal there of the queer existence within that? But to go back to where I was going, the elements of the protectiveness through this kind of homonormative kind of assimilation into kind of heteronormative society, so i.e. gay acting straight, to kind of, again, simplify it there, and protecting these kind of harmful ideas, it begs the question, like, harmful how? Like, how do we define harm? Because I might turn around and go, a deeply conservative kind of position that argues that women shouldn't be allowed in politics, or women should be housewives and really shouldn't have the vote stuff, is a deeply harmful belief towards particularly female identifying or people who are read as female or women in society. Whereas I don't, for example, view many sexual practices as particularly harmful, with some notable exceptions that I'm sure I don't have to go down into. But when harmful is in and of itself a subjective term, what is harmful to you, for example? why do you think, for example, you need to remain anonymized? What harm do you think might be connected to you if this was to kind of get out as your name?
I mean, harm, there's the kind of harm in career, in life, in whichever kind of goals you've set for yourself, into the kind of free actualization of whatever you want to do. So that is the harm I think we're talking about here when it comes to anonymizing this. But then the harm I have in mind, right, that this is physical, bodily harm and mental harm. And I think because you asked me about my definition, I met up with a person for SM. I'm not sure whether that was through Grindr or Recon. It might well have been through Grindr, which, was the first mistake there.
Sorry, why do you think that was a mistake?
Yeah, I was going to come to that, but I think it's a mistake because it's much easier to download Grindr and to write that you're kinky without having thought about it than to download Recon, knowing what it is, and having to fill out a profile, which maybe, should include some kind of information about what you have done, about what you would want, which then in and of itself requires self-reflection about what you enjoy, what SM is, and where you want to go.
Oh, so just for clarity, because people might not have used Recon, actually, people I think are quite familiar with Grindr, but for those who aren't, it's a very brief kind of thing, like almost Twitter bio length, right? You've got to kind of fill in 5 pictures, and then it's just a list of attributes: what position sexually you like, how tall you are, that kind of thing. Where so based on what you've said there, Recon is more in depth. You said to create like an actual profile and reflect. So just to clarify what you mean there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Grindr description is spot on. For Recon, first of all, you have to pick, I think it's up to 5 things that you like from a fairly extensive list. That's anything from suits to bears to bondage, master slave, impact play, fisting, water sports, trackies.
So when we say bears, we mean the kind of gay stereotype rather than like you're a fan of grizzly bears or like polar bears or something. Like I'm a fan of like, hummingbirds, but I imagine when you're talking about your various likes on here, it's specifically from the kink community.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the wish to keep a friendly grizzly bear. I bet there's surely people already doing that, and surely they have a very popular Instagram account. So right. And then seeing that list and having to pick something already, if you want to pick something which you enjoy because you want people to pick up your profile, you need to know what those things are. That already presumes or will lead to a level of education that you don't get with Grindr's how tall am I, and am I a top or a bottom, or am I versatile? And then for the profile text, it varies, but I would say that people write kind of a fair amount of text on there. I think maybe 200 words. I mean, I have no idea, but it feels like that at least, and often you find a profile which will explicitly say, like, read this before you message me, which people may or may not do. But, it's a broad community, and writing that out there is also just necessary, because if you say only enjoy kind of bondage and don't want any sex, in that you shouldn't message a profile which talks a lot about kind of anal play, right?
Okay, so you met up with someone from Grindr, if you want to carry on.
Yeah, the person said that they were experienced, fairly young, but people do different things. He arrived at mine. I happened to have owned a cane at that point. So a fairly long kind of wood cane from a softwood, which is often used for spanking and impact play. And I told the person, if you want to use that at any point, take it and use it. He did, I want to say, in a way that felt very, very violent, just because they clearly never held such a thing in their hands and clearly didn't know how much it can hurt. He clearly didn't know how to handle the thing, and it was so bad that I stopped it, because honestly it felt like I was on the verge of being assaulted, right? And that is harm. And the thing that was missing there was consent in a way. Yes, I had said that, you can use this, but then the implication being in a way which is pleasurable and isn't, causing me harm and kind of a sore bum for 4 days.
That's actually quite interesting. And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I think this is actually a really interesting conversation here we can latch onto about this kind of definition of harmful. Because I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you hadn't actually laid out those boundaries with him. You said he could use it. Well, he did. As you said, use it, he did. Your own words. So who's at fault? Is there anyone at fault, I guess, first of all, in this question? Because obviously what happened here was you viewed this as a particularly harmful, like, again, by your own words, a harmful act. Well, where's this boundary between it not being harmful, which you obviously had assumed you were on the same page with, versus it shifting into harmful? And I know this is a conversation that has come up over and over again and will come up over and over and over again in the podcasts that I'm having. But yeah, how does that...
Look, I think you're completely right in saying that. There hasn't been a discussion of what I consented to, what was acceptable and expected. And I don't think I'm going to answer your question about who's at fault, because it's always going to be a two-way thing. I don't think it's very interesting for the story for the purposes of what's happening here, and I think you can gather from my retelling that I think that this is a larger kind of onus or responsibility on the person, kind of with the cane in that moment.
Why is the onus on them and not on you to draw your boundaries clearly? I say this with the deliberately provocative question here. To be clear for those listening, I know this is a provocative question. I'm not in any way trying to kind of assign any element of victim blaming here, but I want to be crystal clear on why you think the onus lies on, in this case, the top or the dom.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because by virtue of the assigned roles of a dom and a sub, the dom will have more control over that situation. But there is an onus to define things, and that was what I was going to talk about. And I think I didn't define it, because this didn't happen in the circumstances that I would usually go for BDSM sex or session, which would be preceded by much more conversation usually and deeper discussion of what each person enjoys. Also, there was a good panel contribution on this topic at the Queer Disrupt conference, so have a look at that. Which was really interesting about negotiation in kink and what that can do. So part of the reason was because this was probably from Grindr, which is by, it happened too quickly for that to be a good discussion. And the other part is that there are, by virtue of it being a community, which we already talked about, there are certain norms. There are certain questions, there are certain types of behaviour which you come to expect. You come to expect from somebody who's held a cane before to start slowly and kind of work their way up. That doesn't need to take long, but to kind of work their way up to a level where they can see, oh, the other person is responding in a way that I think we both find pleasurable. That there is always an ongoing conversation. But what you do not do when you have done that thing before is hit a person indiscriminately with a cane and think they will enjoy it.
This does make me think of people, you see it on Grindr a lot. So for clarity's sake, I'm on Grindr, I'm not on things like Recon. But I always think it's interesting, and I know we've had this conversation before, I think in preparation for this podcast, very briefly about people who say on Grindr things like no limits, a no limit sub. And I've forgotten how you phrased it the other day, but you said you're allergic to people who do bad kink. Are you people who haven't done the intellectual work behind it? Perhaps I'm being obnoxiously provocative, make up your own mind about that. But I do think it's dangerously unsafe when someone says that, for the reasons I think you said, they haven't actually thought about it. The first question I ask is no limits. Well, that's just not true. That's just simply untrue. Everyone has a limit. Or if there are no limits, it's further than anyone should reasonably expect. I'm thinking of the German cannibal. That is a limit that is too far. I think it's fair to say pretty much too far, as it were. And the argument there coming up is obviously like whether or not that person is actually able to consent. I would say that's no longer sane, as it were, in the safe, sane, consensual. But the example I always give is, oh, okay, no limits. Can I handcuff you to a radiator for 5 days? And it's a deliberately rhetorical question. I would never do that. It's not what I'm interested in. But the answer is nearly always no. It's like, well, that's a limit then. Or the other one is, can I scar you? Is another one I've mentioned before. Can I brand you? Which is something that takes place in more extreme, or what people would class as extreme kink. The answer is no. It's like, well, that's a limit. What you think is what you've seen is kind of, as far as the kink community, and do correct me if you disagree here, in terms of the kink community, it often means that someone's seen something, some very mild bondage, or something very mild spanking on Pornhub or something, and gone, ooh, this is fun, and wants some kind of limit. And I know I mention it in the next episode, so I won't talk about this a lot, but there have been things where someone has asked me to do things to them, and I've just gone, nope, not engaging with it. Like, that was my limit. And that one actually was like lasting self-harm on someone that I just wasn't prepared to engage in.
One addition which I think should be made is that we are talking about this as two people who have engaged in some of this and who have done the intellectual work and who have explored themselves. If somebody puts that on a profile and wants to get into SM and isn't experienced, there shouldn't be barriers to that, right? And I'm aware that this conversation, I think, can kind of build an image of SM like, oh, you need to have done that, like this list of things before you can kind of be initiated or be part of this, which is that there shouldn't be, right? But what should come is a kind of knowledge base, not a list of things that you've done, but an awareness of the things that are going on, and if the language that you're using and what you're looking for. So if anybody's listening to this, like, don't take it as a please stay out of our community, like, don't. Come. We're very friendly, but I am allergic to bad kink.
Yeah, I think there's a good point there, and I think it's becoming more normalised, these kind of discussions and education that takes place. I know just at Warwick University, because that's just where I'm based, there's a fetish society there, and I actually attended one of their events, which was basically how to basically utilise rope play and bondage in using ropes in safe ways. And there was a very kind of frank discussions there. I know Birmingham has the Birmingham Bazaar, which is often a BDSM based kind of educational space, as well as the opportunity to kind of explore. And I think it takes place in the Nightingale. But it takes me to the question of either like this kind of definition of harmful and this kind of who defines that. And again, I mentioned it briefly in the next episode as well, so I won't go too much in depth. But I'm on PrEP, pre-exposure prophylactic, and I go for my 3 monthly checkup. And one of the things they do there is just a regular kind of STD checkup and stuff. And I remember when they read me as male, and I said I tend to have sex with men. My actual definition is I like men and I like dicks, and sometimes they overlap. But they read that as a kind of an opportunity to be like, oh, okay. And he asked me this question, which was, do you engage in fisting? Out of nowhere. And I was like, excuse me? And I remember just giving him this look, like, what the hell are you talking? Like, where did that come from? Kind of thing. And it was interesting because he had made the connection between gay communities and fisting as a kind of specific act that apparently only took place in gay communities. And I go in this in more depth in another one in the next conversation. But it turns out basically what he was talking about was the risk of anal fissures and actually hepatitis B, I think, or hepatitis C, one of the heps, that is more easily transmitted through, in this case, kind of anal fissures and anal tears. And I made the point to him, actually, like, why didn't you ask about that then? Why fisting? Like, because using large dildos and sharing large dildos would carry the same risk in this particular definition, arguably a higher risk, but that's not what you're asking. You're tying it to a very specific act, which is there. So I guess I want to ask the question, and as you are someone engaged in the community, in the kind of kink BDSM community, however you want to define that, what does fall under high risk, and how do you define those kind of high risk conversations, and then how do you negotiate consent around them? And just some examples, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking like electroplay, I'm thinking breath play. I don't know, you'll have a better idea than me on this one, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, let's get the obvious things out of the way, right? Limits that people very often kind of state are things involving blood and needles, anything permanent. So we're talking about kind of scars or other kind of permanent marks on the body, which people tend to put down to the limit. Scat. So that's play with feces. It's often something that is mentioned, and those are kind of fairly safe baselines. Most people won't go for anything which is very long term, so I'd say longer than a day and night. I'm not sure. I think that varies really for people. On that topic, there is a great YouTube video from, I think, a person called Whiteout Rubber, interviewing a friend of theirs about a weekend-long isolation and bondage session and fulfilling fantasy, and what that kind of has actually taken in terms of bodily but also mental work and preparation. I think that's a great one to watch about negotiation and consent and the community recommendation there. And I think some people might kind of have strong feelings about findom. So those are the limits which are often there, which might be seen as kind of high risk in some way.
Sorry, what was that word that you said there? Findom, I think it was.
Yes, so that's short for financial domination, which will involve one person sending money to another person in regular intervals whenever they demand. Large sums, small sums, whatever it is, and there are discussions around this. I would say because that can take, in the eyes of many, including myself, kind of veer into something quite harmful when people get deeper and deeper into it and spend a lot of money they might not have, when the person doing that is not well kind of educated, hasn't thought things through, and might be on a power trip.
Oh, okay, so I see what you mean in terms of you feel like it can move into abuse quite quickly. Okay, so you mentioned a lot of these kind of limits, and by limits we mean the limits of what someone's boundaries are, and they will not kind of engage in certain things when we talk about those limits. But what do you, I guess for want of a better phrase, I'm less interested in what the limits are, but more interested in how do you define those limits. Like, okay, great, that's your limit. Why is that the limit? What makes that the limit? Now, you made that very clear in, for example, financial domination is the risk of abuse. But the argument could be made, again, to be provocative here, if you're tied up and you can't see, there's an element of abuse there. So what renders that level of trust and conversation different from a level of conversation and trust that you might engage with for a more, heavy quotation marks, traditional BDSM session?
Yeah, totally fair question. And all the things I've mentioned can all be done in a safe way, in a way that doesn't go into abuse and is enjoyable and good for all the parties involved. I think you mentioned safe, sane, and consensual earlier, which is a set of principles or shorthand for the kind of things that kink should be in order not to go into abuse. And the issue is that, it comes exactly to the conversation we're having about what is safe, right? And then another term proposed to kind of go around that is risk-aware consensual kink. Because of all those things, everything we're talking about, you mentioned breath play and electroplay earlier, everything has risks. The question is, how easy is it to avoid that level of risk? How easy is it to make sure that those things don't go into a direction which the people doing it don't want? For some things, that is harder than for others, which is why they tend to be discussed. Breath play, for example, can go wrong very quickly when you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, autoerotic asphyxiation, which
Just jump in there for the most common example of that is auto, as in the strangling of oneself or limiting the oxygen to oneself whilst often masturbating. But no, I really like this idea of, was it risk aware consensual kink as quite a good one. And something like breath play, for example, in that case, I would argue that's probably more risky because of how quickly it can go wrong. So for you, is it to do with the kind of how far something can escalate and how quickly something can escalate to a certain level? Or, I mean, is that kind of your definition of what makes something a limit or particularly dangerous? And I'm using dangerous here in an objective way, as in a risk to oneself or one's body in a way that crosses the boundaries that we've demarcated, rather than something that society or a heteronormative society might deem as risky.
Yes, so how far can things escalate? And then also, how easy is it to stop certain things? And that tends to be easier with physical things which don't involve a very complicated setup, say of ropes or restraints, because the moment you go to that, if something does go wrong, it takes time to untie somebody when something has happened. And therefore, we're going into a higher level of risk, right? Therefore, anything which is psychological, which comes with a very great power dynamic, is or can be more risky for people because it might be harder to break out of something, right? If you've spent several hours in a very submissive state of mind, you might be more inclined to agree to things that you wouldn't usually agree to. That is part of the play, absolutely. But that is also where we're going into something where being aware of that risk and being educated and having had a conversation about it is so much more important. And also, I think that comes back to the financial domination example we talked about earlier. And one last thing, this also depends on who you were doing it with. The example I mentioned earlier about the random grinder person and the spanking, that was more risky because I didn't know the person. A person that I've played with 10 times will know much more what I can take, what I want, what's enjoyable for both of us. There's a level of trust and there's more knowledge about each other's abilities, which enables you to go further without crossing into that level of risk. If I do certain things with the person that I haven't met before, it might be much more risky than if I do the same thing with someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. But I also think it's quite interesting how you link actually to, hopefully, I think it's going to be one of the last topics that we talk about before we wrap up, this idea of tunnel games, which is actually something I think when I mentioned to you, I was looking about talking about this. So for clarification of how I came across this term, I only came across this term literally the other day, and it was when I was looking up another guest actually for the podcasts. I think it's actually going to be the one that was aired before this on I was looking through various dominatrixes and their websites and what their sexual interests are, because they draw very clear boundaries in a very professional way about what they are and aren't prepared to engage with. So for example, some say might be a very one person defined themselves as a very classical dom, and by that they mean purely domination, no kind of sexual gratification in its most explicit way as we might understand it there. Go home and wank afterwards or whatever kind of thing, like, you know, but for all intents and purposes you're there to lick my shoe or whatever. And someone used the term tunnel games on there, so I looked up, and so being with I'm framing it in this way to give an awareness that perhaps my definition is slightly wrong, but I hope you can see where I'm hoping to go with this. And I think you hadn't heard of the term, at least not in this particular phraseology before. But tunnel games are, from what I understand, a type of kink or bondage or dominatrix, often dom sub as a kind of framework here in particular, where there is no way to get out of it. I.e., once the process of whatever scenario or whatever it is that you're doing is underway, you can't just safe word out. So even in like higher risk activities, you gave the example there of rope play. I would argue a risk-aware consensual kink, a ethically responsible dom in that scenario, would always have a pair of safety scissors or bandage scissors ready to cut rope if there's an emergency. This is why we do classes. In the class that I went to, we learn about a certain level of gap between the skin and the rope. So someone can't slip out, but at the same time, you don't cause nerve damage in fingers if you tie it too tightly across the wrist, which is a very legitimate kind of concern. So to give an example of what a tunnel game might be, there's something called figging, which is a whole new thing that I looked up. And that, as an example, is peeling a clove of ginger or a bulb of ginger and putting it inside some sort of orifice. Now, you can pull that ginger out, but the effect of that carries on, and there's no way to stop that. Another example might be if you're engaging in something with drugs. So the idea of chemsex, some people often view as extremely risky, because it lowers inhibitions in certain ways, which even on pre-arranged boundaries, they stop applying when everyone is in a kind of non-sober state of kind of chemically induced whatever. And there's no way of kind of shortcutting that out. You kind of just have to ride it. What are your thoughts on that? Because my very brief looking, some people were saying there's no ethical way to engage in tunnel games because there is no out, or there's no opportunity for someone to get out, regardless of how comfortable they are when they start. You can never predict the exact direction that a particular scenario might go. If someone has an adverse reaction to something, how do you deal with that? So what are your thoughts on that?
So this is the one thing you mentioned before, and I hadn't heard the term. In general, when it's something involving any kind of rules about not stopping any act or practice that you do, that, to me, it rings a lot of alarm bells, right? If you agree that we do this, and if you say the safe word, it won't change anything. That, to me, seems unsafe and unethical, because the person doing it could stop, right? And then drugs, I would kind of place somewhere in the middle, because frankly, that applies to probably all drug taking, not just drug taking in the context of sex. If you take ecstasy or MDMA, if you smoke a joint, there probably is no way for you to stop that reaction, regardless of why you are doing it. Or if you can stop it, it will be quite difficult. Why that would change in a sexual context, I can't really see. And if you kind of go so deep with drugs that you cannot kind of verbally or physically say and show that you aren't enjoying something anymore, then you've probably gone too far, not just from a consensual standpoint, right?
Yeah, I'm just whilst we were talking, I was looking up other examples of what people might class as this, and I think there's some interesting ones. So chemical play, which is the kind of tiger balm or the kind of ginger or whatever, because it's causing a chemical reaction on the body. But there's another example that someone said that I've just looked up now, so I'd be quite interested. The idea of some sort of, say, chastity or bondage or something, but the keys to the padlock are put in ice or something like that. So you can't just artificially stop it immediately. I mean, obviously there are ways you can kind of do things. You can pour hot water on the ice and things like that if you need to, but there's no, I mean, I guess you could arguably smash the ice if you had the means to do that. But that's different from picking up a key from the bedside table and unlocking, right? Which you can do in a matter of seconds. So this then takes a much longer time. Another example, actually, which would be quite interesting, is being whipped with stinging nettles, which I have seen before. I've never done, but I have seen before. So how do you engage with something like that then? Like, what makes something more dangerous in an edge play scenario? I think rope bondage where there's no way to get out, I think, is, for example, a very particular type of high risk. But what about something like the ginger, which, whilst deeply unpleasant, might not cause lasting harm in terms of a week down the road, you're going to be feeling it, right? One example on here is someone put capiscum, which is the chili pepper, right, on them, and they said that lasts 20 to 30 minutes. Even if you want to nope out of that 1 minute in, the most it will last, according to the way this person framed it, is 30 minutes. Can we negotiate on these kind of boundaries, and how and what does that look like?
Look, of course, there is the beginning of an issue here, because otherwise we wouldn't talk about it, right? And otherwise the argument wouldn't kind of intuitively make sense, because if it stops being enjoyable for whatever reason, and there is no way to stop it, it will probably be some kind of issue of some sort. And I had written down that kind of toothpaste and tiger balm as well before you set that example. And look, the way I would get around that issue, and the same with the nettles, is the fact that if you engage with this, there are ways for you, for both people actually, to experience what that will involve. You don't need another person to do figging. You don't need another person to put tiger balm on your body. And if you want to experiment with something and see where your body and where yourself stand in relation to a practice, do it, and go in prepared and go in knowledgeable, because then that issue won't arise. So because it isn't a theoretical issue, it isn't an issue of where might this go, which is interesting for an academic argument, but which isn't interesting for the very physical kind of sexual things that we're talking about here. Because if you don't get into that situation, because you know before then, you know, it's safe and nobody has a bad time while doing it.
So how do you practice something like autoerotic asphyxiation? Because by that definition, from the way you framed it there, I would argue that from the way you framed it, that that's such an inherently unsafe activity, no one sane can safely engage with that.
That's right, and I don't think it applies to all practices. There have been very tragic incidents with autoerotic asphyxiation, and then there will be people who have experience with that, who know what's going on, and who can initiate, if you will, who can try, who can learn with you, and you can put yourself into safer hands than you would be if you did this with a person who doesn't have experience. That doesn't get around the risks. None of these things do. But they bring us closer to a point, I think, where we can see this more easily as a safe practice, and an individual can make that choice, right? And I think that's the point we want to go to. And then one thing, because you mentioned that the chastity thing, I love chastity, amazing stuff, do it. But there is a line here. I've heard a great argument on a blog, which is called Denying Thumper. You might want to check that out. That any kind of play of that sort will involve a degree of fantasy, and arriving at the last point of your fantasy may be inadvisable. It may be impossible, and it will probably require some kind of participation and play and suspension of disbelief on your part. Specifically, the vast majority of chastity devices are escapable as long as you don't have a piercing which prevents that. So if you are locked in chastity and you think you are put in this inescapable fantasy that you so deeply crave, that will probably require you to also have some discipline to actually play along with it. And then something which in the first place might seem as kind of crossing a line or being unsafe might not be that. Or maybe you don't need to go as far, because there is an opportunity to live out a fantasy in a way which doesn't remove any and all obstacles, but which is still regardless enjoyable for both people, but brings us closer to a point where less accidents can happen.
Cool. Thank you. I think that probably brings us towards the end, actually. I think that's probably a really useful place to wrap up. I think it kind of gives us a kind of, for those who are perhaps outside of this particular kind of community, this kind of kink and BDSM community, gives them quite an interesting way of kind of looking in, as well as, I guess, looking out for perhaps another way of framing it, and the kind of boundaries and rules and regulations and community. And I don't mean these in negative ways, but the kind of the social rules and boundaries that we have, and how that does shift depending on what we're kind of viewing. Okay, so I just want to say thank you for being here, and yeah, we'll leave it there. Do you have anything final things to say?
No, thanks for having me. This was very enjoyable and often harder than I thought, to kind of look from the inside and to talk about things which I by now kind of take for granted, but which very well might not be. So this was great. I hope everybody enjoys it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for staying put and listening. I hope you found something interesting from that. I know I did. I really kind of enjoyed it. Again, I feel I'm kind of limited in what I can say. I'm super cautious about what I do and don't want to say in terms of this particular individual. Just a massive thank you to them, obviously. I obviously won't be sharing any of their kind of social media or anything. But also a big thank you to Josh Leach, who stepped in to voice act when necessary there for us at last minute, which was absolutely fantastic. Again, please have a go at the survey. Follow us on all of our socials as usual. And next week, the episode is called Spanking on the NHS, where we are joined by Dr. Emma Shepherd from Coventry University, and we look at how chronic pain and BDSM kind of intersect, and how do people use BDSM to help manage in a kind of a therapeutic way, as well as a kind of a really important part of their identity when they come from a background that is particularly more marginalised. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you all next week.